Okay, folks, thanks for joining our Monday Mindshare. It's the preseason time here in the Northern Hemisphere, and a lot of athletes, of course, starting to ramp back up. And one of the things, of course, is to ramp back up their fat burning machine as they look forward to the season ahead. Now, it's not easy coming off usually loose diets and lower training. And we obviously have a regression on our, fat ox efficiency in the off season. SFuels is not advising ketogenic lifestyle so much. We are advising live low and then targeted in certain types of training, and certainly in racing a higher carbohydrate support for optimum performance. And in the preseason, there is a real role, though, in actually measuring blood glucose and ketones in the blood to understand our status and when we're back on track, if you will, for efficient fat oxidation. And today I want to share three things as the top areas of focus, separate to training, but specifically to diet, to help you accelerate that transition back into an efficient fat oxidation machine. Then your nutritional ketosis is in that optimal range where you want it to be. And then I'm going to show you the top 10, in my point of view, foods and drinks that will accelerate getting to a really efficient fat oxidation machine. And we'll try to do that in a few weeks and move on to the season with great performances. So let's first baseline ourselves on whether we are actually in the optimal range or not. It's good to understand where we sit as we go into the season. Now, nutritional ketosis, as we refer to it as, is really when you're mostly burning fat for fuel. We're generating ketones as a function of that because the carbohydrate supply is lowered. So in a measurement context, typically the references and the ranges that would be users would say that between 0.5 and 1 millimoles of ketones in the blood is really the beginning of nutritional ketosis. And ideally, we want to be in that 1 to 2.5 millimoles of ketones in the blood as an indicator that we have good, efficient fat, I should just say good fat oxidation taking place. We can use, say, a Keto Mojo test meter to do a blood prick. It's testing the BHB, the ketones, if you will, in the blood. Or you can use a breath analyzer that's actually measuring acetone. Both of these are helping you to understand where you sit in those ranges. I'd probably steer clear of the urine strips to test your ketones. They're not that accurate. There can be a lot of hit and misses. Now, this is really just testing that you're actually in that optimal range. Other measures like a VO2 max substrate test, which can be done at a endurance lab or university lab, or there's a lot of now sports science labs that you can go and have this done. And what they will do is test at different intensities, speed, if you will, on a treadmill when you're running, or power on a bike. It will be testing how much fat and carbohydrate you're burning at different intensities. And as you begin to obviously train, as you come into the season, as you begin to get the diet dialed in, you'll see dramatic changes. And we've seen in some athletes changes go from 0.5 of grams per minute of burning fat, move right up to beyond 1.5 grams per minute. So not to mention the other measure, of course, is just how we're feeling and our performance numbers in training. These are all factors that are going to help you understand how well you're processing fat and carbohydrate in our bodies. Now, the top three focus areas. Now, this at a high level may sound basics, but I'll try to weave in some specific nuggets that will really dial up, if you will, the best practice to accelerate and facilitate that transition back into efficient fat oxidation and nutritional ketosis. So the 3 hour, and I'm going to dive into each of these, is reducing carbs, not calories, point one. Point two is raising your medium chain triglyceride fats and supporting with exogenous ketones. That's point 2. And point 3 is to raise your salts or electrolytes. Yes, sodium, but critically potassium. And we'll talk about both of these in a second. Okay, so let's start on point number 1, reducing your carbs, not calories. Now, remember the objective here with reducing carbs is all about trying to dial down the stimulation of insulin. Insulin is one of the master anabolic hormones, and its job is to lay down fat, not to burn fat. So anything that digests to glucose, doesn't matter how complex of a starch it is, but ultimately it will digest to glucose, will trigger an insulin response. Now, clearly, the amount of whatever that food is you take, and it's usually a mix of foods, of carbohydrate, the load of carbohydrate will clearly have a higher stimulatory effect. And also the refinement, if you will, of that sugar. And that's a function of then how fast it actually moves through the gut and into the blood sugar, creating this spiking effect, if you will, of blood glucose and having therefore a resultant or a reactionary spike in insulin to deal with that. For a transition, now there's the obvious foods to avoid, and folks who have been in this for a while could dial these down and state these as good as I can. But your bread, cereals, pastas, rice, and your starchy vegetables. If you're thinking that complex carbohydrates are fine, go to your pharmacy, buy a urine glucose test strip, and take the starchiest carbohydrate you can think of, chew it around in your mouth for a while, and then put the urine test strip in your mouth, and you'll see that it changes to the color representing glucose, meaning that even in the most complex carbohydrates, even for many of those carbohydrates, by the time it even leaves the mouth, partially digested into glucose. So if you think that just by using complex carbohydrates, you're avoiding stimulation of blood glucose, spikes in blood glucose, I'm sorry, but that's just not the case. Also, your non-berry fruits, most of those other fruits will also have either a high load or refined sugars, fructose, etc., that will stimulate a high blood glucose response. And then in addition to that, obviously all of your processed forms of refined sugars and drinks, chocolate drinks and juices and sodas, your flavored yogurts, your ice creams, all your baking, etc. So what we've said, if we're going to reduce those things, but we have to maintain caloric levels or energy levels that we're bringing into the body, the way then to do that, if we're not going to have all of that carbohydrate, is we have to raise our fat consumption. And there are 3 types here, and it's important to understand these 3 types in choosing more of the types that are going to help to accelerate this transition. These 3 types of fats are processed quite differently in the body. And if you rely just on the most complex type of fat in your diet, you'll find that transition is going to take longer because you have to build up the enzymes to turn fat oxidation on. And the most complex fat, the long chain triglycerides, actually have quite a complex enzymatic process to bring it into the body and process it as fat. So for long chain triglycerides, here's the types of foods we're talking about. We're talking about olive oil, fish, most of your nuts, avocado, beef, and eggs. We want you to bring these into the diet, but just know that these have got to go through the gut, through the liver, through the lymph, then into the blood, and then into the cell. And even when it gets into the cell, it requires more enzymatic treatment than the next type of fat I'll talk about. And that's the medium chain triglycerides. Medium chain triglycerides are in foods like coconut oil, palm kernel oil, your butter, milk, yogurt, cheese, etc. And the reason why it's more interesting is because it goes from the gut and through the liver into the blood, and then into the blood into the cell. and it's far more efficient. It's a lot more like a carbohydrate. I'm going to talk about this on the second point of why we need to dial this type of fat up, particularly in this transition period, because it's easier for the body to turn that fat into energy as opposed to the long chain fats. The last type of fat is the short chain fatty acids. You can get these in foods like cheese and butter, but also a lot of the fermented foods. Think, soy sauce or kimchi, yogurt, etc. But the body will take certain foods in, and it will actually, through the bacteria in the lower intestine, create the short chain fatty acids, and they're absorbed into the body as form of nutrition. Now, the body doesn't use short chain fatty acids so much for energy. There's other functions that performs in the body. The two fats that we're going to be using mostly for oxidation into energy is those long chain fatty acids and your medium chain fatty acids. And both of those triglycerides, both of those are processed differently. As I said, the long chain ones, more complex to process, medium chains, much easier to process. And that brings us on to point number 2, and that is to raise medium chain triglyceride fats. And again, we'll talk about them in a second, more about them, and to support with exogenous ketones. The medium chain triglycerides are the most ketogenic of the fats in terms of the ability to trigger the body to generate ketones. Now, as I said, these come through the gut into the blood supply and then into cellular oxidation. There's much fewer enzymes required to generate generate energy through the medium chain triglycerides. These are easier to process than the long chain fats. So there's actually 4 types of medium chain triglycerides. And don't worry about the complexity of it all, but there's 2 types, C8 and C10. They are the most ketogenic of the medium chain triglycerides. And that is what you're going to find in SFuels Train, in SFuels Race, in SFuels Revival, in SFuels Keto 3, in SFuels Transform. And in this transitionary period where we're trying to accelerate, because it takes some time, accelerate the upregulation of fat oxidation, and that does take a little bit of time, the use of medium chain triglycerides as much as we can in the diet is going to facilitate, as you upregulate the enzymes, you're supporting that with an easier fat to burn. Now, what I also said is not just to support with medium chain triglycerides, but also to support with exogenous ketones. There are 2 types of exogenous ketones. There's ones that they bind BHB, the ketone fuel, with salt, and it's essentially tasteless. Obviously, there's the salt, sodium, but then it's also in another form as an ester, which you'll see these on the market. They're quite expensive, and it's not that they have jet fuel characteristics in the spirit of generating energy, but they taste like jet fuel, and they're working on it, and hopefully one day they'll make this better. But this is what you'll see, the salt form exogenous ketone that you'll see in high amounts in our Revival product, and we'll talk more about that in a second. In some of my own testing, I've seen that, and I've seen testing from some of our other athletes. So we're going to do a whole program on that. We're doing more testing with athletes right now, but you can see 2 to 3 times an increase in ketones in the blood after providing and supporting the body with exogenous ketones. And that ketone in the blood can then be used as an available fuel to help during this transitionary period. Remember, if you're shutting down the carbs and it's taking a little bit of time, firstly, for the enzymes to switch on to basically provide the fuel for energy, in that period, what can we do to support the body where you've reduced carbs and it's still taking time to turn on the fat oxidation efficiently? Well, that's the function of consuming some exogenous ketones, and it will just help during this transitionary period in giving you the energy, feeling good as you move through this period of upregulating the enzymes for fat oxidation. Okay. Let's talk about the third point, and that's raising salts. And I said sodium, but as critically important, also potassium. The reason why this becomes a concern and an area to focus on for low-carb athletes, and particularly again in this transition, is because as we reduce the carbohydrate, that insulin is coming down. And one of the functions of insulin is that in the distal part of the kidney is that insulin would typically act on that part of the kidney to reabsorb sodium back into the bloodstream rather than let it be passed out. So as we see a reduction in that insulin, that reabsorption is not happening as much, and therefore we lose sodium, and with sodium, fluid, water, out of the body. And you usually find then that also this imbalance, very commonly you'll hear of this tiredness and weakness that comes about in this transitionary period as we go back into a season and we try to switch back on an efficient fat oxidation. We're trying to make this transition back into that. There's a tiredness and weakness. Some refer to this keto flu in its, I guess, most acute form. But the reason why that is happening is because in every cell you'll have, I shouldn't say in every cell, but in a lot of cells, you'll have this sodium potassium pump that's actually pushing sodium outside the cell and potassium inside of the cell. And there's actually a difference between the amount of sodium potassium across those membranes, and it creates this electrical gradient. And that's critical and functional to many of the cellular processes, particularly nerve impulses. That gradient, that difference between sodium and potassium is really important to drive a lot of those cellular processes. When we get it out of balance, and if you all know when you're physically got a gut infection and you'll have either vomiting and or diarrhea, and you'll lose a lot of the fluids, you're losing a lot of that potassium, you feel really weak, and weak in the legs particularly, that is because you've lost a lot of that sodium potassium. Very similar of what is happening during this transitionary period when we see sodium and potassium getting put out of balance. So what's important as we go through this keto transition to help you do it quickly and accelerate the process and feel still solid and strong in your legs and your energy levels, etc., is to upregulate the consumption of sodium and potassium. Okay, so they're the three areas that are most critical to focus on. Let me now give you what I think the top 10 foods and drinks to really accelerate and transition that return to an efficient fat oxidation machine and also ensure that we're in nutritional ketosis. I'll start with the foods. Okay, meats, salmon, beef, bacon. The reason why I call these three out, obviously they're high in protein, they're obviously high in fat, but these three foods actually also quite high in potassium and sodium. So salmon particularly for potassium, beef also for potassium, and bacon high in sodium. Eggs, obviously for the reasons of fat and protein. Avocados, we all know why we're talking about avocados from the fat perspective, but it's also one of the highest foods in potassium. And if you want to create a really high potassium food, and it's probably a food that you all like, guacamole of avocado, tomato, cilantro, onions, garlic, olive oil, and salt is going to bring you that fat, that very high potassium and high sodium. Avocado is very high in potassium. As a food, guacamole is just a great mix during this transitionary period to give you mineral balance plus your fats for energy. Yogurt, in steering away from the sugared off-the-shelf yogurts, take a Greek yogurt, whatever flavor of SFuels train you prefer, think strawberry lemonade or the pomegranate, etc., and then add pistachios. It's one of the highest foods in potassium. And if you want to add something into that that's further giving a nice twist, take your 90%, say a Lindt dark chocolate, one of the squares, and break that up into small pieces. You're now getting high fat, high potassium diet without a lot of glucose And it's just a great sweet type food to have as you go through this transitionary period, but still maintaining the nutritional macro profile we want in a food. The last one I'm going to give you, again, high fat and high sodium, is take cream cheese and slice up sticks of celery and then wrap it in smoked salmon. And it's going to give you the high sodium. It's going to give you some potassium, plenty of fat, plenty of calories. So there's 5 foods I think are going to be high in the minerals you need, high in the fats that you're going to need to help you through this transitionary period and move through it in a fast way. Let's talk about drinks. I'm actually going to give you 6 drinks. So it's not true that the top 10, these are the top 11. So first 2 drinks are really just more in the spirit of both potassium and just a hydrating drink. Whole milk, very high in potassium, one of the highest foods in potassium. A green drink, whether that is your beet greens, meaning the leaves from the beet plant, or spinach. That one you can mix up with the coconut lime train, SFuels train. It's just a really great green drink. All of those 2 drinks of just whole milk and the green drink, very high in potassium levels. Now I'm going to give you 4 drinks that these are my ketogenic acceleration drinks. And the reason I say this is that they're going to upregulate the MCT levels. They're going to upregulate the generation or the provision of ketones, and they're going to accelerate fat oxidation itself. The first one is take a shot of coffee with SFuels Revival and whipping cream. And you basically take your shot of coffee, pour your cream in, 100 mils of cream, and then on top of that, a scoop of Revival. The Revival has the 6 grams of ketones in it, exogenous ketones. It has plenty of salt, sodium, and you're going to mix that up. And between the caffeine in the coffee, the exogenous ketones, don't be surprised if you see your ketone levels take quite a rise within an hour or 2, and it will remain risen for several hours. You can do the same if you don't want a hot drink or a coffee. Not everyone likes coffee. Take SFuels Revival again and take some watermelon prime and the primed drink. That's going to give you your caffeine, and then some cacao. Put all of that with, again, 100 mils of cream or whipping cream, and put it into the blender with some water up to 16 ounces, 20 ounces, etc. And you've got this chocolate watermelon creamed shake. And you're going to find similarly high ketones, high caffeine, and it's going to keep that level of ketones elevated. It's just going to help you through this period of transition while your fat ox enzymes raise. It's just going to help give you a supporting supplement of having high ketones in the blood as an energy source. Third drink to look at, take Train, whether that's a strawberry lemonade or pomegranate acai, mix that with primed lemonade, primed pineapple. And again, that's going to give you high dose of MCTs in the Train formula, and you're mixing that with caffeine, and caffeine has a known a ketogenic effect itself, and also improve the breakdown of fats, a lipolytic effect in terms of improving those enzymes associated with burning fats for oxidation. And the last drink, similarly, is it's a twist on a drink that we know has been used for centuries, and that's chai tea. And chai tea typically would have a very high amount of sugar. But what you can do is take black tea and take SFuels Transform, again, high in MCTs, got some sodium, potassium in there, and then you mix it with chai spices. And I'll give you the recipe for that in the show notes, pretty simple. And then you basically bring all that together, add some whipping cream, or even just a dash of milk, and that's going to give you a really strong both caffeine, MCTs, and like chai tea, it's going to have that nice spice and sweetness to it through Transform. So they're the top 10. I hope it helps you. A lot of the ideas of these things come out through both our SFuels lifestyle, the quick start guide. I'll put the link in that so you can download it onto your phones and have it. And then also our SFuels lifestyle guide, and I'll put a link to where you can download that, all the different recipes, etc. Hopefully this helps you as you kick back into this season of upregulating your fat oxidation in an accelerated way, shooting you back into nutritional ketosis, and really having the performance that you want to have in this new season ahead. Hope that helps. Thanks again. Thanks for joining. Go on.